Welcome to Oxford North America's webinar, Neurodiversity in ADHD, Understanding and Leveraging Strengths in the Diagnosed, presented by University of Oxford Professor Gaia Scherif. I'm Sally Benner, Associate Vice President of Development for Medical Sciences at Oxford North America, based in Manhattan. Professor Scherif joined the University of Oxford in 2006. She's a fellow at St. Catherine's College at Oxford, where she joins us today. Professor Scherif leads the academic research group Attention, Brain, and Cognitive Development, or ABCD, in the Department of Experimental Psychology in the Medical Sciences Division. Her research focuses on the development of attention control and those underlying attention difficulties, from their neural correlates to their outcomes on emerging cognitive abilities. This focus is important because attention influences how we learn and behave in everyday situations, and it is particularly relevant in the classroom. Many developmental disorders are characterized by attention difficulties, and Professor Scherif aims to understand how they are similar, how they differ, and how difficulties matter to learning. Before I hand the microphone to Professor Scherif, feel free to add a question in the Q&A box on your screen. She'll present for 30 minutes, and then I'll return to moderate the discussion based on your questions. The session will be recorded and made available on the Oxford North America's YouTube channel. At the end, stay for the closing slide where you can learn how to support Professor Scherif's research at Oxford. It's now my pleasure to introduce and hand over to Professor Gaia Scherif.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad to be here, and thank you, Sally, for that wonderful introduction. I'm speaking from a surprisingly sunny Oxford, and I wish I could share those pictures with you. What I am going to share is my interest in attention, which has been, I hope you can now all see my screen. An interest in attention, which has been long lasting. I've been interested in attention for now over 20 years and has highlighted many really interesting conclusions that I'm going to discuss today, and many less intuitive aspects of how attention matters in everyday situations. Perhaps the most intuitive is the idea that attention influences what is learned and done. But maybe less intuitive in the last 10 or 15 years of attention research and science has become the interest in understanding how what we've previously learned and what we now remember guides our attention. This interplay, the working together of attention, learning, memory, and action over time is key to then understanding how attention may develop differently from early in life. And there, attention neuroscience has also given some interesting insights that I want to start with from today. First of all, a large part of our brain is dedicated to directing attention in our environment. There are multiple networks of the developing brain that are dedicated to attention, and those are slowly developing. But a third key point that attention neuroscience also highlights is that these changes in brain function are dynamic. They don't just simply happen via maturation. It's not the case that a single area of the brain comes on, but rather in its integration, is in its interactions with other parts of the brain, and crucially with the environment, we witness the development of attention. Now, those three key insights have some implications for how we then understand ADHD. Never focus on the brain alone when trying to understand ADHD, and never forget the learning environment in which people with ADHD are placed if you're trying to understand the impact of ADHD on learning. And that's really the take-home message that I'd like you to go away with today. What are then those learning environments that we're all faced with, but particularly children in school are faced with? This is actually a picture from a pre-K classroom. I'm using now terms that my collaborators in the US have taught me to use. But it's very much an environment that pre-K kindergartners share across the world. It's a complex, visually complex environment. It's auditorily really complex, and therefore it's attentionally demanding. Paying attention here is no mean feat. And yet there's another really interesting element that I'd like to highlight in this observation of what happens in a learning classroom. Attentive learners here vary hugely in how they pay attention. So some children are holding their brains in, some children are ready to ask a question about this music lesson, and then my favorite child in the classroom is actually looking entirely elsewhere, another person is taking the picture. So that's not to say that he hasn't learned or won't be learning in the classroom, but it's really to emphasize that learners attend differently in every learning event that they encounter. And that's really important. It means that if we want to understand diversity in learning, we really need to use converging complementary techniques that might be looking at the brain and maybe look at directly where we attend to using eye tracking. That's what that second picture there is indexing, but that actually going out and observing how attention operates in the classroom is really key also. And so today I'm going to use these multiple methods to try and discuss and highlight what we understand so far about the strengths in ADHD. Starting from what I believe is a welcome revolution, the move that is really quite recent, sadly, but the move away from thinking about ADHD solely as a disorder to an aspect of diversity. And I hope we can discuss this in question time later on as well, why I think this is a positive change. I will then focus on particular aspects of learning that I've been fascinated by, attention in the context of learning about maths, and I will explain why that is. And then I'll move on to practical applications. How do we adapt, or how can we adapt learning environments to foster diverse learning, with bigger implications if we have time right at the end. Okay, throughout this talk, I'm going to highlight that attention science is a collaborative exercise, and there are many, many people who in fact have taught me and who have worked with me on the questions that I will highlight. And I also have to thank funders, in fact, for the support that they've given us. And when there are questions that I think are really pressing, but actually haven't been funded yet, I will highlight those as well. So I'll start with what is thought of now as a traditional approach to understanding ADHD. The traditional approach is to compare children and young people with or without ADHD using a variety of methodologies. For example, as in the picture represented there, using an MRI machine, magnetic resonance imaging, and using fancy analytical techniques to study how the brains of young people with ADHD differ from those without. And I won't dwell on the data right now, but many, not just us in this particular team of researchers, many researchers have highlighted differences between the brains of people with ADHD and those without, which is really interesting because especially early on in the discussions and narratives about ADHD, when ADHD used to be labeled as bad behavior, actually neuroscience played an important role and an empowering role in understanding that there are differences in the brain, not just in the manifestation of bad behavior. But that can't be the endpoint. Highlighting those differences in brain structure cannot be the endpoint of what we ask. We must also ask how those brains engage with what they want to achieve with their environment. And this is why that project, the project that I'm describing, was in a sense a little bit less traditional. We asked how much the external environment might matter to young people and children with ADHD when they engage in tasks that they normally find quite difficult. So the task we use is an impulse control task, a stopping task. You can imagine riding along and going, and then all of a sudden you have to stop. That request to stop impulses is actually something that people with ADHD find very often quite difficult. But what are the networks that are involved when you engage in a task like that over time? And we discovered that, in fact, for everyone in our study, a really interesting network in the brain that's come to be called the mind-wandering network, the default mode network, that is very heavily engaged when you're not paying attention, was deactivated, decreased in activation when all participants engaged in this active task of stopping responses. But there were crucial differences between children with and without ADHD in how they responded to motivations. In this case, motivation was rewards, a point-based scenario, a game that they were playing. Neurotypically developing children, let me talk you through the graph as represented there, showed the activation of that mind-wandering network, whether they were highly motivated or not so highly motivated by points. They just control that mind-wandering network. But children with ADHD needed motivation They did, in fact, deactivate the DMN just as much as neurotypically developing children, but extrinsic external motivators really mattered for them more. Under low incentives, they didn't deactivate that network, which goes to show, and to us show, therefore, that it is really not the case that simply the brains of individuals with ADHD do not do inhibition, impulse control, but that it's rather very dependent by how their external environment engages them. And that question to us is something that remains a really important question. Going back to how we interact with our environment as we attend is an overarching framework, an overarching question we continue to ask. How can we modify the environment so that what seems to be really difficult and a no-go area actually becomes possible? But it's still an approach that focuses on difficulties. And what I think is really a really interesting revolution in the last 10 years is that more and more researchers like me have started to rightly pay attention to what adults with ADHD, their parents, young people and with ADHD tell us about their ADHD. And there are very many videos, and I'm sure maybe you've watched or maybe you've recorded about yourselves, that really are powerful in representing one thing that attention science has not done for people with ADHD, which is to move away from the idea of attention as a deficit only. So Scherif Mahane here is a young man with ADHD who is also an attention scientist, and he says, just to talk through his key messages, and there are many, that attention deficit and disorder as a classification to him was personally very difficult to handle. While on the one hand, it empowered him, because it allowed him to understand some of his difficulties. It also only focused on the difficulties and therefore was scientifically misguided, he argues, because focusing on the disorder does not identify when, how, and for what attention is optimal in people with ADHD. That's a missed opportunity. And that is why one of our current goals in a collaborative study is to actually ask adults with ADHD and autistic adults as well, because that work was motivated by work on the autistic spectrum, how they attend, how they're distracted, but under what conditions they focus or even hyperfocus, and what in their learning past fostered good attention. Because otherwise we miss some scientific and applied educational opportunities. Adaptation cannot be adapted to foster strengths if we don't understand the strengths. Research cannot be focused on understanding optimal adaptations and good attentive learning in ADHD if we never study it, if we only ever study difficulties. So what is this welcome revolution? Really important, a revolution that mustn't dismiss difficulties, and that tries to understand how they are, at least in part, dependent on non-optimal environments. That highlights needs, both for research and practice. We need to understand the strengths and adaptations that adults with ADHD show, and then we need to use some backward engineering, some understanding of those strengths in adulthood, and understand whether we can put in place some of those optimal environmental factors that have helped some individuals with ADHD for more younger people, children on the ADHD spectrum. So let's turn to what we know about earlier in life, before or at diagnosis. And this is in fact where most of my work at present is focused. How does attention neurodiversity matter for early learning? And I've already shown you a picture of a classroom, a pre-K classroom, to indicate some key features of learning environments. But I want to highlight some key features of learning environments in the context of early maths learning. Why maths, you might ask? Why being interested in maths learning? Well, it turns out that maths learning is a very strong predictor, as strong, or in some studies shown to be even stronger, a predictor of educational outcomes and literacy. Educational outcomes, occupational outcomes in STEM in particular, and well-being also. So we must understand how the foundations of maths emerge and how attention can support them. So let's take then this question of emerging numeracy with an example of a very simple foundational skill that educators in pre-K classrooms try to foster, understanding quantities. Certainly to learn this skill as a child in that classroom, and you see there are many learning groups, as they often do in pre-K. They need to represent quantities, and they need to understand symbols and number words and digits. Those are content, math content ideas that are key. But at the same time, what's also really important is how those attentive learners engage with that learning event. How do they focus attention, alert to the task at hand? How do they avoid distraction? This is already a pretty complex environment. How do they inhibit irrelevant goals? Well, actually, I would really like to go outside and speak to my friend now. How do they maintain focus on that goal of learning right now? A really interesting feature of the evidence so far is that emergent numeracy, attention, and executive function go hand in hand very heavily, and therefore understanding how they work together and how we can facilitate their interplay is key. It turns out that another really important element of that interplay is the educational environment. And in fact, I've nearly covered the hand of the supporting adult, so I'm going to backtrack there. You can see that here the educator is playing a really interesting attention directing role. She's pointing to the one car, she's hiding away the elements that might at present be distracting. Then there will be a big reveal. It's one car and one the digit one and one of other things, not cars, to really support and scaffold that learning of quantities. So the educational environment, meaning the input that educators can provide, is key to this emerging knowledge. Why do I say that? Why is it key? Well, we know this because we've been involved in studies that have asked exactly that question. How do young children, and these are children spanning from 3 to 5 years of age, engage their attention as they're learning? And we've studied those age-related differences, so how do young and older children differ from each other? But today I want to focus, in fact, on how we followed some of those children who were 3 and 4-year-olds when we first saw them before they entered formal schooling, with a range of maths tasks that are appropriate for this age group. Here I'm representing 2, but we actually ran many more. They're all fun, so the kids are really engaged in these maths games, and also attention games that were equally fun and engaging, but require them to, for example, stop, just like the task that I was telling you about earlier on in the scanner. Stop when required, remember, switch from one role to another, all skills that we consider as key attention and executive functions. But we also observed carefully the maths learning environment that these children were exposed to because we were visiting them there. What did we find? We found some really interesting observations that I want to highlight today. First of all, as I highlighted in the picture, children were very variable in their attention and in their maths. Not only that, but the strongest attention, the children with the strongest attention and executive functions were also the children with the strongest maths. And this is very briefly data that shows that whenever we looked, those skills really related to each other. Not only that, but the children with the strongest attention and executive functions also were children who later had stronger maths and improved in their maths more. So this interplay is really critical, not just in the now, but also in predicting the future. And finally, and this wasn't something that our study has set out to really ask, but we were really intrigued that we discovered that educators' input also varied hugely. The maths learning input and scaffolding input that educators were providing was really quite varied across settings, so that the children who were in settings where practitioners were using broader and more varied maths language were also children who had better numeracy. So directing attention via maths language is a key way of learning about maths. So that study set the scene up for now being interested in understanding even more what are the multiple ways, those diverse ways in which we could help learners hit the attention sweet spot for learning maths. I'm going to explain what I mean by that. I mean, those children are all variable. Some children are more attentive than others, and yet what we really want to do is capture the best way for each of those diverse learners to nonetheless still learn maths. How do we do that? I've already said that some of what we do to answer that question requires working in the lab, and some of what we do absolutely requires going out of the lab. So we must take the attention lab out of the lab, and that's what we've been doing and continue to do, with the purpose of understanding how young learners engage when they're learning with maths, and not just how well they engage, how attentive are they, but also how differently do they attend. Are quick and what looks like distracted observation just as good in some cases as really focused observations, or not? So that we can understand diverse optimal learning environments and modify them. Then that knowledge needs to come back to the lab so that we can manipulate it. We can test whether changing those environments can make learning better. And we can do that in the lab using VR, or we can do that in real classrooms by working with practitioners and educators on real life interventions. And that's what I really want to talk about for the rest of my talk, specifically for learners on the ADHD spectrum. Much of this work is already funded. The focus on ADHD, in fact, in this context is a little less funded, and we'd love to pursue that further. So let's close off before we move on to applications and optimizing of environments, close off with what we think we've learned by looking early. So not the reverse engineering of not only looking at adults, but now also thinking about trajectories, what happens earlier in life. Early childhood data tells us that even prior to the onset of having to sit down in school, there are strong relationships between attention differences and early maths. Are there practical implications? Yes, we think there are. One, we need to understand different ways in which we can hit that attention sweet spot for maths learning, but for other domains as well. And I specialize in attention and maths, but very interesting parallel questions could be asked of reading and literacy or other skills in science that you're also interested in. The second need is the need to really leverage that idea that attention, EF, and maths work together so that we can improve maths learning and not give up on good maths learning. So let's turn to some of those applications. In the last few years, I've been collaborating with some great colleagues, and I must thank for this title, Sally, because in discussions on what we were doing, I realized that I was using words like adapting and fostering diverse learning, but actually what I really wanted to convey was the idea that there may be multiple ways in which better learning can be achieved. And part of the trick for us as scientists is to understand what those multiple ways are so that we can provide them for all learners. Okay, so the ONE program is in fact trying to do that. What does the ONE program stand for? The ONE stands for Orchestrating Numeracy and the Executive, so bringing numeracy and the executive together. It's a co-developed curriculum-based intervention that is play-based because we're actually working with children before the onset of formal education, co-developed with educators and with an explicit educator development and training element, because practitioners, educators told us that they didn't feel they knew enough about early maths and how it works in the context of attention, how those two work together. The goal of this co-developed intervention for educators and for us is to bring children to practice attention challenge in maths, not give up on it, but practice it. Too little attention challenge and EF challenge, we believe, will lead to poor learning, boredom, lack of interest. Too little challenge is not good, but too much challenge in attention and executive functions may lead to catastrophic failure. So what we really need to think about is how we hit that sweet spot of attention and executive challenge and improve maths in young children, but also collaborate with early years educators who ultimately are experts and want to work to adapt environments around them. So what have we done so far? We've developed a theory of change, so thinking about why we think this is going to work. We've reviewed the evidence, we've co-developed materials, we piloted and refined them with educators, and that's also meant observing the preschool environment, the pre-K environment very carefully, which has been really insightful and interesting. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. We've assessed children's attention and maths as we have done before with very many age-appropriate and fun games, but then also moved on to the practical and applied side of this program, which is the educator training aspect, where we've exchanged knowledge and disseminated knowledge about attention and executive function, but also gathered feedback and exchanged ideas on good practice from educators. We've suggested some really interesting activities that I'm going to describe in a moment. Those activities are for educators to carry out in the classroom in their everyday routines. They don't require sitting in front of a screen at all. In fact, they're integrated in the curriculum and they're flexible. How do those work? Well, this is one of the 25 activities that we've co-designed, special hopscotch. It has some key features. For example, evidence-based target maths content. Here we're targeting counting and numbers, but in other activities we focus on shapes and space, or patterns and ordering. All of the activities are explicitly described to practitioners, to educators, so that it's very clear what we're trying to achieve, what is required, and that all activities have an explicit element of maths, but also attention and executive focus. And then what we also do to facilitate the idea of capturing the sweet spot is that we suggest how to add or modify and change executive challenge and attention challenge in those games. There are some other features to the activities that you may be intrigued by. Some of them are best played in small groups, but some are big groups. Some are best played outside, some are best played inside. And then we really jointly agreed with our advisors and educators that diversity in activities, while being focused on theory and evidence and so on, is really important, because educators need that element of choice, and so do children, so that they are best engaged in the activities that they really enjoy. So far, great. We're at the stage where we're collecting input, in fact, from practitioners on how those have gone, and we're shortly going in to observe the fidelity, so the extent to which the practitioners manage to carry out the activities with their children as we had agreed. And then we'll assess and find out whether the children who were in our intervention program improved in their maths and executive functions and attention more than other children who were not. Now, why do we think that this kind of approach would be particularly helpful for children who are neurodivergent, who differ extremely in their attention? In part because of some sad observations. I told you we observed the pre-K settings very extensively, and that was a pleasure, but sometimes a really difficult thing to do also, because I'm very clearly observed that when neurodiversity is not understood, there are some serious and very sad consequences even before school is entered. This is a picture to represent how, when behavioral difficulties in particular emerge in the pre-K classroom, it's maybe early to spot inattention, but behavioral difficulties, hyperactivity is easier to spot. When that emerges in the preschool classroom, at least one of the responses is exclusion, so that the focus ends up being on behavior management alone, which then by default doesn't focus on identifying special interests for that particular child, and may assume poor attention is something that happens all the time, even though if redirected, it may not happen all the time. It assumes poor executive functions and memory. But again, because the focus is on behavioral management and not on identifying how to bring that child back to being interested, then that leads to reduced opportunities for learning. And in our context, in the context of our studies, reduced opportunities to learn, for example, early maths. And I'm going to give you one example, in fact, to make that really clear. What do I mean by that? In one of the settings I visited, I had the pleasure to work with a young child who was autistic, and he displays quite severe difficulties in sitting down and sitting down with others. However, he is super interested in number. And as the number lady came into the classroom, he just came to find me so that he could sit with me. Now, he, sadly, in observations earlier, he had been quite excluded by many from many learning activities. And so that conversation to be had with educators is a key conversation to be had, because when neurodiversity is not understood, when you don't pay attention to it, then what you might have is poor understanding and confidence of how to deal with it, poor understanding and in practice. So in lower opportunities are provided then to those children for maths learning in everyday activities. The emphasis is on something else. So the one is one approach. I'm sure, in fact, there are others and we could discuss them, but it's one approach that tries to bridge that gap between educators and children and provide adaptable practice, but evidence-based maths games that have an attention and an executive sweet spot, so that over time, we're hoping to see better scaffolding and self-regulating maths learning that fosters children's attention, no matter what it was like to begin with, and that fosters exposure to maths in fun games as well. And I've described the preschool environment, the pre-K environment a lot, and what I've really left out of that description is a key role that parents, who are the first educators, so children also play. And I want to tell you in closing about this other study, a really important complementary study that's also ongoing in my team, led by Alex Hendry, who has been very interested in supporting families with a connection with autism or ADHD, because ADHD and autism cluster in families. Parents of children with autism and ADHD may have young toddlers who are at risk for having executive function difficulties or at least differences in attention. And the goal of this project is to bring parents in, empower them really, to do even more than they already do to boost their young child's executive functions and attention, but without stigmatizing them. And that's been a really, really interesting learning exercise for Alex, who's led this project, but also for me as a mentor. So let's close this final section, later section of the talk with saying, well, there's pretty good evidence, I've told you about some of it, that attention and executive functions relate to maths learning, so that we should foster their interplay in all learners. But the big question is, how do we do that? Let's not stop at the evidence and let's make it practical. Well, we believe that for neurodivergent young learners who then may be later diagnosed with ADHD or have just been diagnosed with ADHD, because attention and executive functions are areas of difference, and in some cases can lead to exclusion from exposure to maths, we really need to think very carefully about how we leverage attention. And that, especially in preschool, but also in kindergarten and in the early years of schooling, actually can leverage play-based activities that are tailored to stretch adaptively both attention, executive function, and maths. Of course, we need to assess the evidence of specific benefits to children on the ADHD spectrum and their educators. And we're in the process of doing that, of looking at diverse learners and their educators. But more evidence will be needed, of course. We also need to support parents and not only think about educators in the classroom, because parents are educators all the time, and support them, in particular if they have family connection to ADHD or autism, because of all of the many pressures that they are actually under. And therefore, again, practical but evidence-based tools that empower them are going to be critical. So taking stock, and then I'm really looking forward to your questions. What are the implications for science of the work that we've been carrying out? Well, I think many, but then of course I'm biased. One, that we shouldn't study attention in isolation. It influences what is learned, but it also is influenced by what is learned. And in the context of studying the interplay between attention and maths, we learn a lot about how attention operates. And we learn a lot about how maths learning operates. So study these two together. I started off by saying that attention development in the brain and outside the brain is not just maturation, it's interaction and interplay. So if these dynamic interactions between attention and developing maths do take place, then well, we better work on integrating attention and EF science with good maths science, good maths learning science, tailored for diversity. And I also said that right at the beginning that interactions do not happen in isolation, that children and older children and young people, and even we as adults and even me as an old adult, we learn in our environments. And so we must involve other significant adults, parents, teachers, and peers in this process of interactions, and play-based integrated activities that focus on embedding a flexible amount of attention and EF challenge into maths learning are a good way to start. If not the only, but certainly not the only way to do this. So are there implications for policy? Well, I think so, and I hope so. And sorry to bring you back to the UK from the US, but perhaps you know that the UK government has been very sensitive and been put under question, in fact, for the poorer employment, educational and mental health outcomes that many children and young people with special educational needs and disability in the UK have experienced. And many children and young people with ADHD fall under this category in the UK. And because of the shortcomings of the services that are offered, the UK government has been asking for a policy review. A green paper consultation is a mechanism for doing that in the UK. And I know that there are similar consultation mechanisms in the US. And we as scientists have an onus, an ethical onus to contribute to that consultation in a way that is participatory. And that's what we're doing here, is to collaborate. We're collaborating with other clinicians, with advocates, with parents, with young people, so that they are represented and And that learning science really feeds into tailoring education at its best for all children. So I have many people to thank for the good things I said today, my collaborators, but especially the children, families, teachers and schools we work with. Of course, I thank our funders, and I thank you for your attention. Any faults or lack of clarity is my fault. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Scherif. It was so interesting. It's nice to see you back again. So we have a lot of questions, and I think we have a full range of the colleges represented here in the US. And we know we did send this invitation out through the University of Oxford in England, so some people may be attending from your neighborhood over there. One question I have, and it's a bit of a transitioning one, is what about people who learn in their adulthood that they've been struggling against undiagnosed ADHD? It's not too late to moderate their ways of learning, say in the workforce or saying learning a new hobby. So learning becomes something they look forward to. And an alum from St. Anne's also asks, could a late diagnosis be a positive?
Oh, that's a great question. Both are great questions. And I can certainly vouch for, yes, we should definitely think about how we modify or understand the challenges and also potential good routes to learning for people who are diagnosed late. Yes, absolutely. And some of the work, some of the survey work that I was describing, I think is going to really help in that respect, because we are really trying to understand how people who are adults and may in fact have been diagnosed as adults, because we're asking for that as well in the survey, thrive, so that we can put those measures in place for more people. But the second question, which was, is a late diagnosis sometimes really helpful? And the answer is unequivocally yes, meaning that what I hear over and over again from people who are diagnosed late is that they say, I mean, I struggled for so long. I found it so difficult and I couldn't understand why I had challenges doing things that everyone else seemed to be fine, completely fine with doing. And a late diagnosis empower them to think, okay, it doesn't now solve the difficulties, but it helps explain them to myself. And that's in that sense, that's what I meant by saying, like Salif Mahane, that a diagnosis can be empowering. But if it stops at that, then it's not helpful. So I hope I have answered those questions.
No, it's always nice to know when you know, certainly we're always in each year more enlightened times that it's never too late if you have a diagnosis to change your habits, and that there are ways to do that. Another question, because you do, when we do know your focus is on numeracy, and you spoke about maths, an alum from Merton asks, what can you say about the application of your research to persons with ADHD whose strengths are verbal rather than mathematical?
Oh, that's very interesting. So as a scientist, I should always say, oh, I don't know about reading or creative writing or oral language, but actually I do know about them. And it turns out that, again, how we attend to thoughts as well as what we encounter in our environment is foundational key to what we learn, our oral vocabulary development, what we then revisit in our memory, how we connect information, and how we then recount it to others. So absolutely, in the context of verbal strengths, there are some really interesting questions about how those might operate in people with ADHD. And in fact, there's a really interesting meta-analysis, so a big study that has tried to review such questions in the context of creativity. So I don't think that they asked the really nice questions that you were asking, you know, creativity in the context of verbal expression, whether it's written or oral. But what they did ask, you know, what is the evidence of creative strengths in ADHD? And there's some really interesting evidence being provided there, especially in children, in individuals, adults who haven't quite got to diagnosis, or what I call, what in that meta-analysis are labeled as sub-threshold, subclinical individuals who don't yet or haven't sought a diagnosis. So there's quite strong evidence there of a really interesting link between their ADHD and creativity. But I don't know that it's actually really getting at your question about oral strengths and verbal strengths. I hope I've answered that
Well, I'm not
question.
going to let you off the hook because there is another question.
Okay, great.
An attendee, I'm sorry, I don't know if you are a graduate, asks, are you or colleagues studying ADHD and approaches to teaching children how to write and teach expository writing?
I am not doing that. I frequently teach young men and women with ADHD because I am an educator here at Oxford. So I must disclose that some of the questions about understanding strengths were completely generated by my students. Students who, as you maybe remember from being an alumni here, we have very close relationships in discussions, in tutorials, and in small, like the seminars, and over and over again, those encourage thinking and sharing ideas, and questions about lived experience emerge. So there were often very successful young men and women I teach who have ADHD. And they are required to write because they write tutorial essays every week for us. So we've been doing, so even though I don't have formal suggestions to make for younger children, for young people, we've really worked on how to deliver the tutorial essay, starting from the great strengths. What I can say, although it's a stereotype and generalization, so I shouldn't be saying that about many of these young men and women, is that they have been so impressive in their linkage across topics and in bringing ideas together in a way that many others in the same class do not do. So really interesting insights and lateral thinking, but that sometimes converting that into a linear structure that starts with an argument and moves on to the next argument, and then again and again, is really a challenge. And so we've worked on that, on recognizing there are some really interesting ideas, and then how do we turn those into expository writing that's argument focused. That's what psychology essays actually are about, that uses evidence and describes it clearly, but does not forfeit that creativity and the lateral thinking. So I don't know if that answers the question. So I haven't done this or advised anyone who does teach expository writing to younger learners, but I've had the pleasure of teaching amazing young men and women, and we've worked on that together.
We're lucky to have you. I have two.
Well, I'm lucky to have them.
We learn from each other, don't we? Two questions similar, so bear with me. One is from Balliol and another one from Brasenose. Do laptops, tablets, or other digital devices for note-taking help or harm classroom performance for uni students with ADHD? And related, is there research suggesting whether working on paper or on devices such as iPads may be better for students with ADHD?
Sadly, I don't think that there is extensive evidence on the pros and cons of written versus other devices-based techniques. However, there are very clear and observable pros and cons when I see these young people in my classrooms. And in fact, we work with what in Oxford is the Disability Advisory Service, DAS, quite extensively to think about how we help. And the lesson learned there is that young people differ from each other in what they find really helpful and what not so. So the group level, the average answer somehow masks what works really well for some and doesn't work so well for others. Where technology seems to be really helpful on average is in providing memory aids and organizational aids, because planning and remembering and just focusing on what the next task might need to be can be a challenge for young people with ADHD. Then those external devices can play a really interesting additional role. And that I've heard and I've seen operate very efficiently, very well. So as not as the single learning tool, but really as a help, as a something that helps in the background but can really rescue difficult situations before they escalate into not meeting deadlines, forgetting what you have to do, and not making it to appointments, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, devices have changed things quite heavily in a positive way for people who would otherwise struggle, especially as they're transitioning into independence and they're not in classrooms like in school where timetables are very set and in a way have to be followed. And when they're moving into independent or self-organization, they really struggle. The downsides of devices can be that devices allow for access to lots of information at the same time, and that can be both a positive and a negative. And there is lots of extensive work trying to understand the positives and the negatives. I mean, if it's for finding content, it's powerful that we can find that content in many interesting different ways. But if that content is then distracting, then having access is not that positive. So the answer is not straightforward at all, in fact, on devices as a learning medium rather than devices as a learning help. And there's definitely more work that needs to be done to have a good answer. My answer for now is that, and that actually converges with what the Disability Advisory Service says here, is that it's really important to think about differences between young people with ADHD and really work with them on what their key goals are and how we can best support them. And those may be different across people as well. So be tailored in that sense is really important.
So you tee up the next question, which was could you explain how the range of attention difficulties might be tracked on a spectrum?
Oh, what a great question.
These are Oxonians.
Yes. Oh yeah, thank you.
Of course.
Okay, so let's talk about the spectrum first, and then we can track it. Then we can try and understand what I mean by saying tracking also, or what we might mean as tracking. So this idea of a spectrum may resonate because, and in fact was very often been associated with autism, not ADHD. But it's become a really interesting way of thinking about dimensions of ADHD, meaning that, and please, I hope I'm not patronizing anyone, so please do say, in the chat, in the Q&A if I am, that, I mean, diagnosis is very categorical. You have ADHD or you don't. But actually, that betrays a huge amount of variability. So by spectrum, what we often mean is differences between people with ADHD, not only across that boundary, which is, by the way, that boundary, diagnosis or not, is a really interesting boundary because it's somewhat arbitrary as well. So we could ask lots of questions about the diagnostic boundary. Where do we place it? Where do we say somebody has ADHD versus not? But within ADHD, there's a huge range of variability in inattention, in hyperactivity, in that combination. And it's leaning on to the question that you were asking, how do we track it, in how that varies within individuals. So a young, a mom, an autistic person, I use identity first language because in autism, many people, autistic people prefer to be referred to as autistic people, not people with autism. So apologies, I'll just explain that. An autistic woman who was running actually a training session for us as researchers, she used the term sphere rather than spectrum, which I'd really like to discuss a little bit. And what she said, what she explained is that, and this I think applies absolutely to ADHD as well, is that there are multiple dimensions. A spectrum feels like it's really linear. You're either here or there or somewhere in the middle, and that's this one line, a spectrum. But actually, she conveyed this idea of a sphere, thinking there are multiple dimensions to our autism, and all of them are variably important. In how she functions in everyday life and her self-esteem and how she, and so the sphere rather than the spectrum is how she likes to think of herself. And other people are on a sphere too. So maybe there's this really complex multidimensional space where you can put people with ADHD and think about how they differ from each other. But also, and this is a really interesting thing that she said, the place where you are in the sphere or on the spectrum is really sensitive to how you feel, what has happened, your previous history, and where you're going. And so it's not as static, that's where I am on the spectrum, but it's rather a really interestingly changing and dynamic place in the spectrum. that changes with time, that changes with intervention, with support, with the, and so how do we track it? How do we track one's position over time? That's with difficulty, but really working together on developing methods that capture differences between people and that are sensitive to change over time for a person as well. So there are some really interesting tools that researchers and clinicians have developed to do that. Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you.
So to that point, I think this one will be related. Do you think that work at the educator level must be taught during teacher training programs to all educators, or as professional development for only maths educators? Do you have curricula developed based on your findings?
Okay, I think it should be taught. It's a great, multiple really great questions. I think it should be taught at the level of training to begin with, not only to maths educators, because these core principles of how attention and learning operate matter for any kind of learning. so as an educator myself, I definitely need to think about them and how they work right from the word go. So that's why they should apply to all educators, I believe. But at the same time, putting them into context is also important. So as you specialize as an educator, either because you become really interested in teaching maths or you become really interested in teaching science, then there may be some really interesting additional tools and skills and thoughts that you need to develop and integrate into that knowledge. And so I think both at the onset and then later on as well. You need to think about that. Do I have programs? It's great. That should be my next one of my next grants, is to develop these programs. The one is an educator development package that it was developed with other educators to work in pre-K. So that we've not yet moved into the primary school classroom, but with collaborators at the Centre for Early Maths Learning, it's a new initiative, nationally funded. We're really interested in actually in moving to working on with teachers and educators across all years. So we don't have those yet, but we will, as a community, have those
for the
tools.
future. For the future. Thank you. From Wadham, as a parent with a kid with inattentive ADHD, what is the one sentence I should say when I'm frustrated with my child?
That's a great question. And I think that a sentence to oneself as a parent is to stop and think. And the second sentence that you may want to offer to your child is now something I borrow from Salif Mahane, who said, if you are the parent of a child like me, perhaps when you see them distracted and you're really frustrated, how about you ask them what they're distracted by? Because you might find that it's something really fascinating. I mean, and I don't want to dismiss in any way the frustration and the difficulties and the hardness of wanting to support somebody you love and really struggles. And in fact, the opening sequence of that TED talk is, pay attention. Those were all things that he was told by people who loved him. Yeah, so, but he reflected on the idea that if attention in ADHD, inattention in ADHD in particular, might be distraction by other things, those other things may be things that is well worth paying attention to, and use them also to redirect focus. So we really don't understand hyperfocus, for example, how it is that people who have ADHD of the inattentive type sometimes really concentrate very, very, very hard for a very, very long time on some things. We don't understand that very well. We tend to focus on the distraction, but perhaps understanding what they're distracted by might actually help us understand hyperfocus too, and then bring them together to a good compromise where you're focusing sometimes on the things that are required by this stupid environment that and sometimes are needed, while at the same time paying attention to the other things that really attract you, the So it's not really a sentence, is it? It's a lot. But this is what he suggests. And he says, if you think, wait, because you regret the anger words, just like his parents had, and then say, so what is it that you're paying attention to? But without dismissing how difficult that is.
So it brings the child, it brings you along into what's going on in the child's mind.
Yes.
We have a little fan note here. A St. Cat's alum said you were his college tutor and says hello. This is Oliver Barnes.
Oh, hello, Oliver. Oh, you recognize the break. It's still the same room. This is where we had tutorials. Oh, great. Oh, very nice. Thank you. Sorry, this is a personal chat now.
Yeah,
Yes.
No,
Yes, so I mean, I've been here for many years now. So there are many of these fantastic students who are now not students anymore. Maybe they are still, but and yeah, it's great to hear.
Forever students.
Fantastic. We're forever, exactly. We are all forever students.
So we have a few questions in the live chat. We also a couple that came in beforehand during registration. And I'll summarize them this way. And you and I have talked about this before. Research studies in the 2000s and 2010s examined the impact of inattention in the classroom on education success with a focus on behavioral control and pharmaceutical interventions. And it sounds like what you're suggesting is that today's research needs to discover a third way that understands the classroom environment a child with ADHD needs around him or her in order to learn. Fix the environment, not the child. Do I have that right? The questions are about really seesawing between behavioral modification and then pharmaceutical.
Yes. So you do have that right, absolutely. I mean, keeping in mind that in no way do I want to undermine choices that are made by young people with ADHD, their families, their clinicians to use pharmaceuticals to bring themselves to a better place. I do not want to undermine those in any way. And we could have a very separate discussion and data on how those psychopharmaceuticals work. A key thing I have learned from working with psychiatrists who are interested in medication is that they are really interested in reducing it. They're really interested in finding ways in which we don't have to use so much of it. And so that's in fact where that project Midas was what that was motivated by: motivation, inhibition, and attention. We were trying to modify the environment via motivation, and understand how that extrinsic external motivation might work to help with the impulse control, so that's behavioral difficulties that are quite prevalent and were the key focus in the 2000s and 2010s of ADHD research. How can we modify the environment in a very simple way in that context and reduce, in fact, or moderate the need for medication? So that study also investigated medication effects. And it's very interesting that extrinsic motivation actually works quite well as a drug for children in that sense, right? It's not drug, but it works quite well in some cases as a drug, in the sense that it has similar effects on brain functioning and on behavior, better behavior. So yeah, that's a really interesting discussion. So I don't want to undermine choices that are either clinically motivated or other motivated. And then again, I definitely recommend listening to the voices of young people with ADHD because they differ hugely. And there's a really interesting project also based in Oxford by a neuroethicist who's really interested in giving a voice to young people with ADHD. And lesson learned I've learned from that project is that there are some young people with ADHD who find that Ritalin methylphenidate is something they will not want to touch ever again, having tried it, and others who find that it really brings them to a place where they can engage and learn. So that full range of variability is represented in their voices. And I think that's something to listen to. Really interesting. But yeah, I'm here as a psychologist who's interested in the learning environment. And I strongly believe, and I think we're getting evidence that if you optimize the environment, so fix the environment, understand the environment and fix it as much as possible so that it is optimal for learning for any child, that will really help. All children learn, and it may reduce the need for medication, but I don't know about that yet, right?
No, it's you know, you couch that as, you know, you're not judging or telling anybody what to do. They know their own child, or they know their students. But this is your research, and this is, you do all the research so it can be implemented, as you showed us the practical impact of it. We've come to the end of our time, and we have so many questions in here that we haven't gotten to, but we do download them. And if you're welcome, or you're welcoming to them, we will send you the questions, and perhaps we can marry them to an email address if you'd like to answer them. And thank you to everyone who registered and entered a question at the same time. Professor Gaia Scherif, thank you for your time. It is past dinner time over there in Oxford, but thank you. I think this has been very helpful to us. And as I said at the beginning, this is a recorded session, and it will be available for you to watch again. It was intense, and to share with others at the oxfordna.org website under the tab events. And we have our webinars. We have a YouTube channel there. And you can enjoy it again and share it with a friend. Thank you for attending today. Thank you, Professor Scherif. We will continue to watch your research, and if you come over to the US, we'd be happy to host you over here at 500 Fifth Avenue. Okay, bye-bye.